The biting Chicago wind whipped strands of Sarah's hair across her face as she stood before the imposing oak doors of the Chicago Chess Club. Each gust felt like a small, icy slap, mirroring the doubts swirling within her. Had she made a mistake? This grand building, with its leaded glass windows and air of quiet exclusivity, seemed a world away from the hushed aisles of the library where she spent her days. The flyer she'd seen, tacked to the community board amongst notices for book clubs and knitting circles, had simply said chess event, all welcome. It hadn't mentioned a championship qualifier. Hesitantly, she pushed open one of the heavy doors, a faint chime announcing her arrival. The warmth that enveloped her was a stark contrast to the chill outside, but it did little to thaw the knot of anxiety in her stomach. The receptionist, a young woman with a kind smile and bright, curious eyes, looked up from her computer. "Hello," she greeted, her voice melodic. "Are you here for the community chess workshop?" Sarah's cheeks flushed. Workshop? That sounded less intimidating. Certainly less like the cutthroat competition she'd inadvertently stumbled into. "Well," she stammered, clutching her worn leather satchel tighter. "I saw the flyer at the library. It said, chess event, all welcome." She willed her voice to sound steadier, hoping she didn't sound as foolish as she felt. The receptionist's smile widened. "Ah, you must be here for the qualifier then. Right this way." She gestured down a long corridor, the polished wood floors gleaming under the soft light. As Sarah followed, the click of her heels against the wood seemed to echo the rapid beat of her heart. A qualifier. The very word sent a shiver down her spine. What had she been thinking? She was a librarian, not a competitor. Her chess experience was confined to the countless games played with her grandfather in their sun-drenched living room, the scent of his pipe tobacco mingling with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed tea. Those games had been filled with laughter, shared stories, and the gentle clinking of chess pieces against the worn wooden board. This, however, felt different. This felt like stepping into an arena. Yet, as she walked, a strange shift began to occur within her. The nervousness, the self-doubt, began to recede, replaced by a quiet spark of determination. She thought of her grandfather, his eyes twinkling with amusement as he'd explain a particularly clever strategy, his hand resting gently on hers as he guided her through the intricacies of the game. He'd always said she had a natural talent, a gift for seeing the patterns hidden within the chaos. He'd nurtured that gift, patiently teaching her, encouraging her, never letting her give up. This tournament, she realized, wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about honoring his memory, about embracing the part of herself he had helped to cultivate. The receptionist led her to a large room filled with rows of chessboards, the low hum of conversation punctuated by the rhythmic tap of pieces being moved. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable energy that seemed to crackle around her. As she surveyed the room, her eyes landed on a figure seated at a table near the front. Richard Blackwell. The name, synonymous with chess mastery, sent a jolt of recognition, mixed with a fresh wave of apprehension, through her. His presence was commanding, his aura radiating an almost palpable intensity. He sat ramrod straight, his steely gaze fixed on the board in front of him, his fingers drumming a restless tattoo on the table. Even from a distance, she could sense the aura of focused power that emanated from him. Sarah watched him for a moment, captivated and intimidated in equal measure. He was a legend, a grandmaster whose reputation preceded him, known for his aggressive play and his ability to psychologically dismantle his opponents before the first pawn was even moved. She recalled reading articles about him, stories that spoke of his ruthless strategies, his unwavering focus, and his almost uncanny ability to predict his opponent's every move. He was a force to be reckoned with, and the realization that she might have to face him sent a shiver of both excitement and fear down her spine. Her first opponent, Tom, was a stark contrast to the formidable Blackwell. He was a kind-faced man with a gentle smile, his demeanor radiating a quiet warmth. He greeted her with a friendly handshake, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he wished her luck. Their game was a quiet dance of strategy and intuition, a conversation conducted not through words, but through the movement of pieces across the board. Sarah found herself slipping into a familiar rhythm, the anxieties of the day fading away as she focused on the game. She played with a quiet confidence, her moves precise and deliberate, each piece placed with a purpose. Tom, despite his gentle nature, was a formidable opponent, his moves carefully considered, his strategy well-defined. Yet, Sarah's intuition, honed over years of playing with her grandfather, seemed to anticipate his every move. She could almost hear her grandfather's voice, whispering in her ear, guiding her, encouraging her. The game ended in a draw, a testament to both their skills and their mutual respect for the game. As the tournament progressed, Sarah found herself facing a variety of opponents, each with their own unique style and approach to the game. She played with a quiet intensity, her focus unwavering, her moves precise and calculated. Each victory, each draw, fueled her confidence, solidifying her belief in her own abilities. In the fourth round, she faced James Patterson, a mathematics professor known for his arrogant and condescending demeanor. He dismissed her as an amateur, underestimating her skills and experience. His arrogance, however, proved to be his downfall. Sarah, unfazed by his condescending remarks, played with a calm precision, dismantling his carefully constructed defenses with a series of brilliant moves. The look of stunned disbelief on his face as she checkmated him was a victory in itself. The air in the tournament hall crackled with anticipation as the final round approached. The whispers grew louder, the glances more pointed. Sarah Mitchell, the quiet librarian, had become the unexpected dark horse, her victories over seasoned players creating a ripple of surprise and admiration. And then the moment arrived. Her name was called, paired against the one name that had loomed large since she entered the room, Richard Blackwell. The hushed reverence of the Chicago Chess Club hung heavy in the air, a blend of anticipation and the faint, metallic tang of old trophies. Sunlight filtered through the tall, arched windows, illuminated dust motes dancing above the green bays of the chessboards. Sarah Mitchell, clutching her worn leather satchel, felt a tremor of unease ripple through her. The room, a symphony of clicking pieces and murmured analyses, felt both familiar and alien. Familiar because of countless hours spent hunched over a board with her grandfather, the scent of his pipe tobacco, a phantom presence in her memory. Alien because these weren't the cozy, firelit evenings of her childhood. This was a battlefield of intellect, where every move was a calculated risk. She watched the other players, a mix of ages and demeanors, united by the intensity in their eyes. Some, young and brash, moved with a restless energy, their fingers hovering over the pieces like hawks circling prey. Others, older and more seasoned, exuded an almost unsettling calm, their gazes fixed on the boards as if they could see through the wood and into the very heart of the game. There was a palpable arrogance in the air, a silent declaration of intellectual superiority that made Sarah shrink further into herself. One man, his face etched with the lines of countless victories and defeats, adjusted his cufflinks with a theatrical flourish, his eyes sweeping the room as if daring anyone to challenge his dominance. It was Richard Blackwell, the reigning champion, his reputation preceding him like a storm front. Sarah took a deep breath, the scent of old books clinging to her cardigan, a faint reminder of the quiet sanctuary of her library. This world, the world of competitive chess, felt so different solid. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind, a gentle counterpoint to the aggressive energy of the room. Chess isn't about intimidation, Sarah, he'd say, his voice warm and reassuring. It's not about who can shout the loudest or make the grandest gestures. It's about seeing what others can't see. It's about patience, strategy, and understanding the subtle dance between the pieces. She found her assigned table number 12, tucked away in a quieter corner of the room. The small, white placard bearing her name felt strangely heavy, a tangible representation of the weight of expectation. Doubt gnawed at her. Was she truly ready for this? Could she compete with these seasoned players, these masters of strategy? She traced the familiar grooves of a pawn in her satchel, the smooth would a grounding presence in the swirling uncertainty of the moment. The pawn, a simple piece, yet capable of extraordinary journeys across the board. Her grandfather had taught her that every piece, no matter how seemingly insignificant, held potential, power waiting to be unleashed. Her first opponent, Tom, was a kind-faced man with a gentle smile. He extended his hand, his grip firm yet reassuring. "Good luck, Sarah," he said, his voice a welcome contrast to the hushed intensity of the room. Their game was a quiet conversation, a respectful exchange of moves, devoid of the psychological warfare she'd witnessed at other tables. Tom's moves were thoughtful, measured, but ultimately predictable. Sarah, guided by her grandfather's wisdom, played with a quiet confidence, seeing patterns unfold several moves in advance. The victory, when it came, felt almost anticlimactic, a gentle affirmation rather than a triumphant conquest. As the rounds progressed, Sarah found herself drawn deeper into the rhythm of the tournament. Each victory, a small but significant step, chipped away at the wall of self-doubt she'd built around herself. She played James Patterson, a mathematics professor with an air of intellectual superiority that mirrored Richard Blackwell's. He dismissed her with a condescending smile, his opening moves a blatant display of arrogance. He underestimated her, just as others had underestimated her grandfather, the quiet librarian who had stunned the local chess club with his unorthodox strategies. Sarah, her quiet demeanor masking a razor-sharp intellect, dismantled his carefully constructed defenses, her moves precise and devastating. His condescending smile faltered, replaced by a look of bewildered disbelief. The memory of that look, the dawning realization of her skill in his eyes, fueled her confidence. Chess wasn't about intimidation, she realized. It was about seeing the board not as a battlefield, but as a canvas, a place where strategy and intuition could create a masterpiece. She thought of her grandfather, his gentle hands guiding hers over the checkered squares, his voice a patient whisper explaining the intricacies of the game. He'd seen the potential in her, the spark of something special, and he'd nurtured it with unwavering belief. Now, in the hushed intensity of the Chicago Chess Club, that spark had ignited into a flame. She wasn't just playing for herself. She was playing for him, for the memory of their shared passion, for the legacy he'd left behind. She watched Richard Blackwell from across the room. He moved with an almost predatory grace, his presence dominating the tournament. He was a force of nature, a chess titan, and he was her next opponent. The thought sent a shiver of anticipation down her spine. This wasn't just another game. This was a test, a chance to prove not only to herself, but to the world that quiet strength could conquer even the most formidable opponent. Chess isn't about intimidation. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. It's about seeing what others can't see. And in that moment, Sarah knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was ready. The muted clatter of chess pieces, a gentle symphony of wood on wood, filled the Chicago Chess Club. Sunlight, filtered through the large windows overlooking Grant Park, painted checkered patterns on the worn wooden tables. Sarah Mitchell, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, inhaled the familiar scent of old books and polished wood, a comfortingly familiar aroma that reminded her of rainy afternoons spent in her grandfather's study. The two of them hunched over a chessboard, lost in their own world. Table 12. That was hers. She smoothed down the simple navy dress she'd chosen, a stark contrast to the vibrant scarves and patterned shirts of some of the other players. A wave of nausea washed over her. This was it, her first tournament. She glanced around the room, each face a mask of concentration, each move a silent declaration of strategy and intent. Doubt, cold and sharp, pricked at her. Had she made a mistake? Was she truly ready to test the skills her grandfather had so patiently nurtured against these seasoned competitors? A kind face, framed by a fringe of gray hair, smiled at her from across the board. Tom, her first opponent, extended a hand. Tom, he said, his voice a gentle rumble. Good luck. Sarah took his hand, her palm slightly damp. Sarah, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Good luck, she thought. I'll need it. Tom's grip was firm, reassuring. He reminded her, strangely, of her grandfather, the same easygoing warmth in his eyes. First tournament? Tom asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Yes, sir, Sarah admitted, her cheeks flushing slightly. I'm probably in over my head. The words tumbled out before she could stop them, a confession of her deepest fear. Tom chuckled, a low, comforting sound. We all start somewhere, he said, his gaze steady and encouraging. Just enjoy the game. Enjoy the game. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. He'd never pushed her to win, only to savor the intricate dance of strategy, the silent conversation between two minds across 64 squares. The opening moves were a blur, a familiar pattern unfolding as if by instinct. She played the Queen's Gambit, her grandfather's favorite, the pieces moving with a surprising fluidity beneath her fingers. Sarah focused, blocking out the distractions of the bustling room, the whispers, the clicking clocks. All that existed was the board, the pieces, and the quiet hum of the game. Tom, she realized, was a good player, solid and predictable. But Sarah found herself several moves ahead, her grandfather's lessons whispering in her ear, guiding her through the complexities of the game. She saw opportunities where he saw obstacles, patterns emerging from the chaos of the board. She wasn't just playing. She was thinking, analyzing, predicting. This wasn't just a game. It was a conversation with her grandfather, a continuation of their shared passion. With each move, Sarah's confidence grew, the initial tremor of fear replaced by a quiet certainty. She saw the subtle shift in Tom's expression, the initial amusement replaced by a flicker of surprise, then a grudging respect. He was no longer playing against a nervous novice. He was facing a genuine opponent. The final move was swift, decisive. Checkmate. Sarah almost couldn't believe it. She had won. Her first tournament game, and she had won. A quiet elation bloomed within her chest, a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the simple victory. It was as if her grandfather was there with her, sharing in the moment, a silent presence in the bustling room. Tom extended his hand, a genuine smile gracing his lips. Well played, Sarah, he said, his voice tinged with admiration. You have a real talent. His words, simple yet profound, resonated within her, a validation of her grandfather's legacy, a confirmation of her own hidden abilities. Sarah accepted his handshake, a warmth spreading through her. Thank you, she said, her voice stronger now, the initial shyness replaced by a newfound assurance. The room, which had seemed so intimidating before, now felt different. It wasn't a battlefield. It was an arena, a place to test her skills, to honor her grandfather's memory, to discover the extent of her own potential. The victory, unexpected and exhilarating, was more than just a win. It was a revelation, a turning point. It was the beginning of a journey, a path she hadn't known she was on, a path illuminated by the gentle light of her grandfather's wisdom and the quiet strength of her own emerging talent. The doubts and fears that had plagued her earlier had faded, replaced by a sense of anticipation, a quiet excitement for the games to come. She was ready. The Chicago Chess Club hummed with a low, electric energy. A symphony of clicking pieces, hushed whispers, and the rustling of score sheets filled the air, punctuated by the occasional sigh of resignation or the sharp intake of breath that signaled a brilliant move. Richard Blackwell, a name that resonated with the weight of countless victories, surveyed the room with the practiced eye of a predator. He stood tall, his silver hair neatly combed back, his face a mask of impassive observation. 58 years of life, a lifetime devoted to the 64 squares, had etched lines of concentration around his eyes, giving him a perpetually calculating expression. A manageable field, he thought, his gaze sweeping over the rows of bent heads and focused brows. No serious contenders, not this year. His fingers twitched involuntarily, a phantom sensation of gripping a knight, poised to deliver a devastating checkmate. He relished the familiar thrill of the hunt, the anticipation of dismantling his opponent's defenses piece by piece. His eyes lingered on a young man, nervously adjusting his glasses, his hand hovering uncertainly over a bishop. Amateur, Richard concluded dismissively. His gaze shifted to a woman meticulously recording her moves, her brow furrowed in concentration. He recognized her a local club player, known for her solid, if uninspired, strategies. No real threat. Further down the row, a teenager fidgeted restlessly, his eyes darting between the board and the clock. Impatient, undisciplined, Richard's internal assessment was swift and merciless. He allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. This tournament, he sensed, would be a comfortable victory. He continued his circuit of the room, stopping to exchange brief, polite nods with familiar faces. Each greeting, however innocuous, carried an undercurrent of dominance, a silent assertion of his superior standing. He paused beside a table where a woman with a quiet, unassuming demeanor sat across from a younger man. Her hand rested lightly on a white pawn, her gaze fixed on the board with an intensity that seemed at odds with her gentle appearance. She wore a simple, dark blue dress, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, not a single strand out of place. A beginner, Richard surmised, noting her hesitant movements, the slight tremor in her fingers as she moved the pawn forward 2 squares. He couldn't place her. She wasn't a familiar face in the local chess circuit. Probably someone's wife or girlfriend, dragged along for the ride. He dismissed her with a barely perceptible shake of his head. Today's field looks particularly manageable, wouldn't you say, Marcus? Richard addressed the tournament director, a portly man with a perpetually harried expression. Marcus Webb, juggling a clipboard and a half-eaten sandwich, looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Well, Grandmaster Blackwell, you'd know better than I would, he chuckled nervously, wiping a stray crumb from his chin. Though there's always the possibility of a dark horse, you know. Someone unexpected. Richard's lips curled into a faint, condescending smile. Dark horses are rare breeds, Marcus, and they rarely survive the first few rounds. True enough, Marcus conceded, his gaze wandering across the room. Though there's that woman over there, he said, gesturing discreetly towards the woman in the blue dress. Mitchell, Sarah Mitchell. First tournament, apparently. Came in off the street, practically. Richard followed his gaze, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Her? Hardly a dark horse, Marcus. More like a lamb to the slaughter, I'd say. He chuckled dryly, imagining the swift, brutal efficiency with which he could dismantle her defenses. He could practically visualize the resignation in her eyes, the quiet surrender as he delivered the final, crushing blow. The thought, oddly, didn't bring him the usual satisfaction. Perhaps he was growing weary of such easy victories. Perhaps, he admitted to himself with a surprising twinge of self-doubt, he longed for a real challenge. Marcus, oblivious to Richard's internal musings, continued. Still, you never know. Stranger things have happened. He took a large bite of his sandwich, his words muffled. She beat Tom Hanley in the first round. Cleanly, too. Took him completely by surprise. Richard raised an eyebrow, a sliver of genuine curiosity piercing through his initial dismissiveness. Tom Hanley, while not a grandmaster, was a seasoned player with a reputation for solid tactical play. Hanley? Interesting. He found himself drawn back to Sarah Mitchell's table, his gaze now more scrutinizing, less dismissive. She was now playing against James Patterson, a mathematics professor known for his arrogant and condescending demeanor at the board. Patterson, Richard knew, was a formidable opponent, with a penchant for complex, calculated attacks. This should be enlightening, he thought, a new spark of interest igniting within him. He watched as Patterson launched a fierce offensive, his pieces moving with aggressive precision. Sarah, however, remained unervingly calm, her expression unreadable. She seemed to anticipate every move, her responses measured, precise, and devastatingly effective. Richard observed, with growing fascination, how she subtly redirected Patterson's attacks, turning his own aggression against him. There was a quiet confidence in her play, a subtle strength that belied her unassuming appearance. He watched, transfixed, as the game progressed, each move revealing a depth of understanding that far exceeded his initial assessment. A knot of unease began to tighten in his stomach. This woman, this Sarah Mitchell, was no beginner. She possessed a rare talent, a raw, untamed brilliance that he hadn't encountered in years. He felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine respect, tinged with a flicker of fear. The word echoed in his mind, startling him with its unexpectedness. Fear? Richard Blackwell, afraid of a librarian? He pushed the thought aside, attributing it to the novelty of the situation. Yet, the feeling persisted, a nagging unease that refused to be dismissed. He continued to observe Sarah's game, his initial arrogance slowly dissolving into a grudging admiration. He recognized in her play echoes of a different era, a time when chess was less about brute force calculation and more about subtle strategy and deep intuition. He saw glimpses of her grandfather's legacy, a whisper of the past resonating in her present. And he realized, with a sudden, unsettling clarity, that this tournament was far from over. The muted click of chess pieces echoed in the hushed hall, a rhythmic counterpoint to the rustling of score sheets and the low murmur of spectators. Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her as she moved her knight, a familiar weight in her hand, a piece her grandfather had carved from a fallen branch of their old oak tree. She remembered his hands, rough and calloused, yet surprisingly gentle as he guided hers over the checkered board, whispering stories of knights and bishops, of strategy and sacrifice. This quiet corner of the chess club, with its scent of old wood and faint coffee, felt oddly like home. Her first opponent, Tom, a kindly man with a nervous smile, had seemed almost apologetic as he made his moves. He reminded Sarah of her grandfather's chess partners, men who played for the love of the game, not for the thrill of victory. She could see the hesitancy in his eyes, the subtle tremble in his hand as he reached for his queen. He played a solid game, but lacked the spark of intuition, the almost preternatural sense of the board that her grandfather had possessed, a gift he had, in some inexplicable way, passed on to her. Sarah won swiftly, but gently, offering a reassuring smile as she extended her hand. He seemed almost relieved, a small chuckle escaping his lips. "You're good," he'd said, shaking his head with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. "Very good." The second and third rounds followed a similar pattern. Each opponent, drawn into the quiet vortex of Sarah's concentration, seemed to lose their footing, their initial confidence crumbling against her unassuming yet implacable strategy. She wasn't playing to win, not in the way Richard Blackwell, seated several tables away, was playing. He was a storm of focused aggression, his every move a declaration of dominance, his gaze a physical force that seemed to pin his opponents to their chairs. Sarah observed him peripherally, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. He was a force to be reckoned with, a predator in this quiet sanctuary of thought. She pushed the thought away, focusing on her own board, her own game. Her grandfather had taught her that the only battle that mattered was the one in front of you, the silent war waged on 64 squares. Her fourth opponent, James Patterson, a mathematics professor with a condescending air, was a different sort of challenge. He approached the game with an almost scientific detachment, his moves precise, calculated, devoid of any emotional investment. He viewed chess as a purely intellectual exercise, a problem to be solved. He saw her as an anomaly, a librarian daring to trespass on his territory of logic and strategy. "Interesting opening," he'd remarked, his voice dripping with a subtle disdain, as if humoring a child. Sarah felt a flicker of irritation, a rare spark of anger that she quickly suppressed. Her grandfather had taught her the importance of emotional control, the power of stillness in the face of storm. And so, she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the board, her fingers tracing the smooth contours of her knight. As the game progressed, Patterson's initial condescension began to morph into something else: uncertainty. His calculated moves met with unforeseen resistance, his logical predictions crumbling against her intuitive grasp of the game. The silence between them grew heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. The click of the pieces became sharper, more deliberate, each move a small act of defiance. The final checkmate was almost anticlimactic, a quiet punctuation mark at the end of a complex sentence. Patterson stared at the board, his face a mask of disbelief. He hadn't even offered a handshake, simply rising from his chair and walking away, a figure of defeated logic. A low hum of conversation began to ripple through the room. Whispers, like tendrils of smoke, curled around Sarah. Who is she? Nobody knows. Just walked in off the street. The questions, laced with curiosity and a hint of suspicion, brushed against her like a cool breeze. She felt a strange detachment, a sense of being both inside and outside the moment. The room seemed to fade, the murmurs receding into a background hum, as she was transported back to her grandfather's study, the scent of pipe tobacco and old books filling the air, the comforting weight of his hand on her shoulder as he guided her through the intricacies of the Sicilian defense. His voice, low and gentle, echoed in her memory. The game, he'd said, is not about winning or losing, Sarah. It's about understanding, about seeing the patterns, the possibilities that lie hidden within the chaos. The tournament director, Marcus Webb, a portly man with a perpetually surprised expression, approached her table, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Remarkable, he breathed, shaking his head. Absolutely remarkable. 4 rounds, for wins. Against some very strong players, I might add. Sarah simply nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. She wasn't playing for recognition, for applause. She was playing for something deeper, something more profound. She was playing for the memory of her grandfather, for the quiet joy they had shared over the chessboard, for the lessons he had taught her, lessons that extended far beyond the 64 squares. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. The quiet librarian, the unknown entity, had disrupted the established order. The ripples of her quiet victories were spreading, creating waves of speculation and unease. The predator, Richard Blackwell, looked up from his board, his gaze finally landing on Sarah. His eyes, sharp and calculating, held a flicker of something new, something that wasn't just predatory aggression. It was curiosity, it was respect, and perhaps a hint of apprehension. The game, it seemed, was about to begin. The rhythmic click of chess pieces echoed in the cavernous hall, a percussive counterpoint to the murmur of hushed conversations. Sunlight, filtered through the high arched windows, cast long shadows across the checkered battlefield where Sarah sat, opposite James Patterson. Table 12, tucked away near the edge of the tournament floor, felt strangely isolated, a small island in the swirling sea of competition. She adjusted her simple cardigan, the wool rough against her skin, a familiar comfort in this unfamiliar environment. Her fingers hovered over the white queen, the cool, smooth ivory a stark contrast to the nervous tremor that ran through her. Patterson, a mathematics professor with a reputation for ruthlessly analytical play, steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on the board with an intensity that made Sarah feel like a specimen under a microscope. He adjusted his glasses, the movement a subtle display of impatience. "First tournament?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the air around them. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The vastness of the hall, the weight of all those watching eyes, pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate the quiet confidence she had carried with her through the first few rounds. Patterson let out a small, almost condescending chuckle. "Well, don't feel bad when this ends quickly." His words hung in the air, barbed with an arrogance that Sarah found oddly familiar. It reminded her of the condescending whispers of colleagues at the library, the ones who underestimated her quiet competence. "He thinks I'm easy prey," Sarah thought, a flicker of defiance igniting within her. Just like all the others. The memory of her grandfather's gentle smile, the way his eyes twinkled when he'd corner her king with a seemingly impossible move, flooded her mind. "Don't be afraid to show them what you know, Sarah," his voice echoed in her memory. The game began. Patterson's opening was aggressive, a Sicilian defense, designed to seize control of the center of the board and dictate the pace of the game. Each move he made was punctuated by a sharp, decisive clack, as if he were slamming a door in her face with every piece. Sarah, however, responded with a quiet strength, her moves measured and precise, like the careful placement of books on a library shelf. She felt the familiar rhythm settling in, the comforting predictability of the 64 squares, the infinite possibilities contained within their boundaries. Patterson's initial confidence began to waver. He shifted in his chair, his fingers drumming a restless tattoo against the table. Sarah's unhurried pace, her unflappable demeanor, was unsettling. He had expected a quick, decisive victory, a swift dismantling of her amateurish defenses. Instead, he found himself facing an opponent who seemed to anticipate his every move, who countered his aggression with a quiet, almost ethereal calm. The hall, which had initially buzzed with the energy of dozens of simultaneous games, gradually quieted. A small crowd began to gather around table 12, drawn by the unexpected tension of the match. Marcus Webb, the tournament director, stood among them, his eyes fixed on the board, a flicker of surprise in his usually impassive face. He had seen Patterson play countless times, had witnessed his ruthless efficiency, his ability to crush opponents with sheer psychological force. But this was something different. As the game progressed, Sarah's strategy became clear. She wasn't playing to dominate. She was playing to understand. Each move was a question, a gentle probing of Patterson's defenses, seeking out the weaknesses hidden beneath his aggressive facade. She visualized the board not as a battlefield, but as a conversation, a complex dialogue between the pieces, each with its own story to tell. Patterson, accustomed to opponents who crumbled under his pressure, found himself increasingly frustrated. He could feel the momentum shifting, the control slipping from his grasp. He glanced up at Sarah, trying to decipher the secrets hidden behind her calm expression, but her eyes, fixed on the board, revealed nothing. They were like deep pools, reflecting the intricate patterns of the game, but giving no hint of the thoughts swirling beneath the surface. With each move, the tension in the hall thickened. The whispers of the onlookers died away, replaced by the hushed expectancy of shared breath. The clicking of the pieces became sharper, more pronounced, each sound echoing the relentless march toward the inevitable. And then it happened. With a quiet, almost hesitant move of her queen, Sarah delivered the final blow. Checkmate. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Patterson stared at the board, his face a mask of disbelief. He reached out, his hand hovering over the king, as if he could somehow rewind the game, undo the series of moves that had led to his defeat. He looked up at Sarah, a mixture of confusion and grudging admiration in his eyes. "My grandfather showed me similar positions," Sarah said softly, her voice still barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "He said, every chess game tells a story, and you just have to listen to what the pieces are saying." The words hung in the air, a simple yet profound statement that resonated with a truth that went beyond the game. Patterson, a man who had built his reputation on the cold, hard logic of mathematics, felt a strange pang of understanding. He had been so focused on imposing his will, on dictating the narrative of the game, that he had failed to listen to the quiet wisdom of the pieces. He had been so busy shouting that he hadn't heard the whispers. In that moment, the victory felt small to Sarah, almost insignificant compared to the quiet sense of connection she felt to her grandfather. She hadn't just won a chess game. She had shared a memory, a legacy. And in doing so, she had not only defeated an opponent, but had also, perhaps, awakened something within him. The low hum of the chess club, a symphony of clicking pieces and hushed whispers, filled the room. Late afternoon sunlight, filtered through the tall, arched windows, cast elongated shadows across the checkered floors, painting the scene in a mosaic of light and dark. The air hung thick with the scent of old wood and anticipation, a familiar comfort to Richard Blackwell. He surveyed the room, his gaze sweeping over the bowed heads and furrowed brows, a predatory glint in his eyes. Each player, a pawn in his kingdom, each move a testament to his dominance. He dispatched his fifth opponent of the day with a swift, almost dismissive checkmate, the man's shoulders slumping in defeat, mirroring the fallen king on the board. Richard felt the familiar surge of satisfaction, the cold, hard pleasure of victory. He'd built his reputation on this, on the ruthless efficiency with which he dismantled his adversaries, both on and off the board. His reputation preceded him, a dark cloud of intimidation that often won him the match before it even began. Another victory for Blackwell. Marcus Webb, the tournament director, announced, his voice carrying a hint of awe, tinged with something else, perhaps a touch of fear. Richard barely registered it. Such reactions were commonplace. He dismissed the defeated player with a curt nod, his mind already strategizing for the next round. Yet, a flicker of movement at the far end of the room caught his eye. A woman, her back to him, sat hunched over a chessboard, her posture oddly serene amidst the tension-filled atmosphere. He recognized her, the librarian Mitchell. He dismissed her earlier, a quiet, unassuming figure, an unlikely contender in this arena of intellectual gladiators. He'd seen her first-round match against that young man, Tom, a pleasant enough fellow, but clearly out of his depth. She'd played with an unusual stillness, a quiet confidence that had unnerved the young man, leading him to a series of blunders that ultimately sealed his fate. Richard's gaze lingered on her, a frown creasing his brow. He hadn't paid much attention to her subsequent matches, but she was still here, still playing. He watched as she moved a piece, her fingers slender and deliberate, her touch almost feather-light against the polished wood. There was a rhythm to her movements, a grace that seemed out of place in this typically masculine, often aggressive environment. He found himself strangely drawn to her quiet intensity, a stark contrast to the bluster and bravado he typically encountered. Interesting, he muttered under his breath, the word hanging in the air, a small crack in the facade of indifference he so carefully maintained. He tried to dismiss her, to refocus on his own upcoming match. He needed to conserve his energy, to maintain his mental edge. Yet, his gaze kept returning to her, drawn like a moth to a flickering flame. He watched her dismantle James Patterson, a mathematics professor known for his arrogance and condescending playing style. Patterson, much like Richard himself, relied heavily on psychological tactics, attempting to unsettle his opponents with a barrage of complex calculations and thinly veiled insults. But Sarah, seemingly impervious to his provocations, had countered his every move with an unnerving calm, her silence a more potent weapon than any verbal sparring. Richard watched, a strange mixture of fascination and unease stirring within him. He saw a glimmer of something familiar in her play, a strategic depth that resonated with a part of him he thought long dormant. It reminded him of himself, but a younger, perhaps purer version, unburdened by the weight of expectation and the relentless pursuit of victory. "She's probably just having beginner's luck," he murmured, attempting to rationalize his growing interest, to quell the unsettling feeling that this woman, this quiet librarian, posed a threat he couldn't quite comprehend. Yet, even as he uttered the words, he knew they rang hollow. Luck couldn't account for the precision of her moves, the unwavering focus in her eyes. He found himself analyzing her game, dissecting her strategies, his mind working overtime to understand the enigma that was Sarah Mitchell. He saw echoes of old masters in her play, subtle nuances that hinted at a hidden depth of knowledge, a lifetime spent honing her craft in the shadows. The thought of a hidden master, a secret prodigy lurking beneath the unassuming exterior of a librarian, Both intrigued and irritated him. He prided himself on his knowledge of the chess world, on his ability to assess an opponent's strengths and weaknesses with a single glance. Yet, this woman, this Sarah Mitchell, defied his categorization. She was a blank canvas, a mystery waiting to be unraveled. He felt a sudden urge to play her, to test her mettle against his own, to see if the quiet strength he perceived was real or merely an illusion. He wanted to peel back the layers of her composure, to expose the steel beneath the silk. He wanted to win, of course, to assert his dominance, to remind himself that he was still the king of this particular jungle. But a new, unfamiliar desire began to take root, a desire to understand, to connect with the quiet storm brewing within this unassuming woman. He dismissed it as mere curiosity, a fleeting distraction in the grand scheme of the tournament. But deep down, he knew it was something more. He felt a shift within himself, a subtle realignment of his priorities, a crack in the carefully constructed wall of indifference he'd built around himself. The game, for the first time in a long time, felt different. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about something else, something he couldn't quite define, something that had him captivated by the quiet librarian across the room. The hushed anticipation of the tournament hall thickened as Marcus Webb, the director, approached the microphone. His voice, amplified through the speakers, resonated with a theatrical flourish. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the pairings for the semi-finals. A collective breath was held. Richard Blackwell, his face a mask of granite indifference, barely registered the quiet rustle of programs being consulted. He expected this. He always expected to make it this far. Years of honed skill, of relentless dedication, had carved a path of victories leading him inevitably to this stage. Sarah Mitchell's name echoed in the hall, paired with his own. Richard's gaze, sharp as a honed blade, swept across the room, seeking her out. He'd barely registered her in the earlier rounds. A quiet woman, almost spectral in her stillness, she seemed an unlikely opponent. A librarian, he heard someone whisper. He allowed a flicker of disdain to touch his lips. This semi-final was a mere formality, a stepping stone to the final victory he craved. Sarah Mitchell, sitting in the corner of the hall, felt the weight of all eyes upon her. The announcement hadn't startled her, not exactly. Each victory, each game won, had felt like a small miracle, a testament to her grandfather's patient tutelage, the hours spent hunched over the worn chessboard in his study. But Richard Blackwell, his name resonated with a legendary aura. She'd seen his matches on television, watched in awe as he decimated opponents with brutal efficiency. A wave of doubt washed over her, a cold trickle of fear down her spine. But then, she remembered her grandfather's gentle smile, his words echoing in her memory. The game is played on the board, Sarah, not in the mind. She took a deep breath, the scent of old books and polished wood momentarily filling her senses, a comforting anchor in the storm of her anxiety. Richard approached the designated table, his steps measured and deliberate, each movement radiating an aura of controlled power. He saw her then, the librarian, already seated. She seemed smaller than he'd imagined, almost fragile. A slight smile touched her lips, a polite acknowledgement of his presence. The smile irked him. It held no fear, no deference to his reputation. You know, Richard began, his voice a low rumble designed to unsettle. I've been playing tournament chess since before you were born. He watched her, expecting a flicker of intimidation, a nervous twitch. Instead, she met his gaze with an unsettling calmness. This is my first tournament, sir, she replied, her voice soft but clear, every syllable precise. Her internal monologue was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Surprise at his attempt at intimidation, a touch of amusement, and a deep, abiding respect for the game itself. She knew this match would be a test, not just of her skill, but of her spirit. The game began. Richard played with aggressive precision, each move a calculated assault, designed to overwhelm, to suffocate. He pushed his pawns forward relentlessly, creating a suffocating wall of pressure. Sarah, however, responded with unexpected resilience. Her moves were quiet, almost hesitant, but each piece placement was imbued with a deep strategic understanding. She moved her pieces with an almost meditative grace, her fingers lingering on the smooth surfaces before committing to a position. Each move resonated not just with calculated strategy, but with a subtle, almost invisible emotional current, a whisper of her grandfather's wisdom. Marcus Webb, watching from the sidelines, felt a shift in the atmosphere. The initial confidence radiating from Richard Blackwell seemed to be slowly eroding. The quiet librarian, initially dismissed as an easy opponent, was proving to be a formidable adversary. Her quiet demeanor concealed a sharp intellect, a strategic mind that anticipated Richard's every move. He leaned closer, captivated by the unexpected drama unfolding on the board. James Patterson, still smarting from his earlier defeat to Sarah, watched with grudging admiration. He'd scoffed at her quiet confidence, dismissed her as an amateur. Now, he watched in stunned silence as she systematically dismantled Richard's carefully constructed offense. Richard felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. He'd anticipated a swift victory, a predictable display of his superior skill. Instead, he found himself struggling, his usual aggressive tactics met with an impenetrable defense. Sarah's moves were not merely defensive. They possessed a quiet strength, a subtle aggression that chipped away at his carefully constructed strategy. He felt a flicker of unease, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. The pressure, the weight of expectation, was suddenly shifting. He was no longer the attacker, the predator. He was the one defending, scrambling to maintain his position. He called for a break, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He needed time to regroup, to understand how this quiet, unassuming librarian had managed to unravel his game. The hall buzzed with quiet speculation. Richard Blackwell, the undisputed king of the tournament, was on the defensive. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of disbelief and admiration. Sarah remained seated at the board, her gaze fixed on the pieces, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the clicking of cameras capturing the historic moment. She replayed the game in her mind, each move a ghostly echo of her grandfather's lessons. She wasn't playing against Richard Blackwell, not really. She was playing with her grandfather, their shared love of the game bridging the gap between the living and the departed. The quiet confidence she exuded wasn't arrogance. It was the quiet assurance of shared memories, of a bond forged over countless games, countless hours spent in the hushed sanctuary of her grandfather's study. The break ended. Richard returned to the board, his face pale, his eyes holding a flicker of uncertainty. The game resumed, but the dynamic had shifted. The predator had become the prey. The low hum of the ventilation system blended with the muted clicks of chess pieces against the polished wooden boards. The air in the tournament hall, thick with anticipation, seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. Richard Blackwell, his brow furrowed in concentration, stared at the board as if it held the secrets of the universe. His opponent, Sarah Mitchell, sat across from him, an island of quiet amidst the storm brewing within him. He hadn't expected her to make it this far. Not past Tom, certainly not past the arrogant Patterson with his condescending smirk. He had observed her earlier matches, dismissing her quiet demeanor as a sign of inexperience. He had expected a swift, decisive victory, a reaffirmation of his dominance. Instead, he found himself in a battle of wits he hadn't anticipated. Each move she made was a carefully considered step, not the hesitant placements of a novice. Her pieces moved with a strange, almost poetic grace, weaving a complex tapestry of strategy that he struggled to decipher. It was like watching a seasoned gardener tending a prized rosebush, each snip and prune calculated precise. A flicker of irritation sparked within him. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He was Richard Blackwell, the Grandmaster, the one who instilled fear in the hearts of opponents. He was the one who dictated the rhythm of the game, who controlled the narrative. But Sarah Mitchell remained an enigma, her placid exterior concealing a depth of understanding that unsettled him. He recalled his strategy session from the night before, the meticulous analysis of her previous games. He had searched for weaknesses, for patterns he could exploit. He'd found none. It was as though she played with a different set of rules, a different language of chess. Now, staring at the board, he felt a cold knot tightening in his stomach. His usual tactics, the subtle psychological games he played, seemed to bounce off her like water off a duck's back. Her focus remained unwavering, her gaze fixed on the board, oblivious to his attempts to unsettle her. The clock ticked, a steady, rhythmic pulse against the silence. Each click seemed to amplify the tension, the unspoken battle raging between them. He moved his knight, a seemingly aggressive maneuver designed to disrupt her pawn structure. He expected a flinch, a hesitation, some sign of unease. There was none. Instead, after a moment of contemplation, so profound it felt like an eternity, she countered with a move he hadn't foreseen, a sacrifice of her bishop that opened up a devastating attack line. He felt a jolt, a sudden surge of adrenaline. This wasn't the play of an amateur. This was the kind of strategic brilliance he had only seen in the games of legends. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, a way to salvage the situation. But the trap was sprung, the net tightening around his king. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. He could feel the weight of the room, the silent scrutiny of the spectators. He could almost hear the whispers, the murmurs of disbelief. Richard Blackwell, losing? The thought was almost unthinkable. Yet there it was, stark and undeniable, reflected in the cold, hard reality of the board. He felt a wave of frustration wash over him, a bitter taste rising in his throat. He looked up at Sarah, her expression still calm, her eyes holding a depth of understanding that both fascinated and unnerved him. He had underestimated her, gravely underestimated her. Where had she come from, this quiet librarian with the skill of a master? Where did you learn that? The words escaped him, raspy, tinged with disbelief. He wasn't even aware he'd spoken until the sound hung in the air between them, breaking the silence. She looked up, her gaze meeting his for the first time since the match began. Her eyes, he noticed, were not the soft, yielding eyes he had initially perceived. They held a quiet strength, a spark of something ancient and profound. "My grandfather," she said, her voice soft but steady. "He said it was from a game by someone named Tal." Tal. Mikhail Tal, the magician from Riga. The name resonated within him, a legend whispered in hushed tones among chess circles. The aggressive style, the daring sacrifices, the uncanny ability to see combinations others missed. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The quiet confidence, the unwavering focus, the strategic brilliance. It wasn't just skill, it was a legacy. She wasn't just playing chess. She was channeling the spirit of a master. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just losing a game. He was confronting a ghost, a specter of the past he had thought long buried. He felt a strange mix of emotions swirling within him: frustration, awe, and a grudging respect. He had spent his life chasing titles, accolades, the validation of others. He had built his reputation on intimidation and psychological warfare, on breaking the will of his opponents. But Sarah Mitchell, with her quiet strength and inherited wisdom, had broken something within him, something far more profound than his winning streak. He saw now the emptiness of his pursuit, the hollowness of his victories. He had conquered opponents, but he had never truly understood the game. He looked back at the board, the pieces arranged in a configuration that spoke of his impending defeat. He saw not just a loss, but a lesson. He reached out and offered his hand, a gesture of resignation, but also of respect. "Your grandfather," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He would have been proud." A faint smile touched her lips, a fleeting expression that hinted at the depth of emotion hidden beneath her calm exterior. "Thank you," she replied, her voice carrying a weight of history, of memories shared across generations, bound by the timeless language of chess. The click of their hands meeting echoed in the hushed hall, a sound that signified not just the end of a game, but the beginning of a new understanding. The hushed expectancy of the tournament hall pressed down like a physical weight. The low hum of conversations, the rustle of programs, the rhythmic click of a distant clock all seemed amplified in the tense silence surrounding Board 1. Sarah Mitchell adjusted the simple pearl necklace her grandfather had given her, the cool smoothness against her skin a small anchor in the swirling sea of her nerves. Across the board, Richard Blackwell, a titan in the world of chess, regarded her with an unnerving intensity. His reputation preceded him, a master strategist, a psychological warrior, a man who could dismantle his opponents with a single glance. She'd watched his previous matches, witnessed the subtle shift in his opponent's postures, the almost imperceptible flinch before resignation. Now, she was the one under his scrutiny. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "Just breathe," she told herself, her grandfather's calm voice echoing in her memory. One move at a time. The overhead lights glinted off the polished surface of the chessboard, transforming the familiar black and white squares into a battlefield of light and shadow. The pieces, weighted and cool beneath her fingertips, felt strangely comforting. These pieces, these moves, this game, it was the language she and her grandfather had shared. He'd taught her not just the strategies and tactics, but the quiet poetry of the game, the intricate dance of thought and intuition. She pushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous habit she'd never quite broken. Richard's eyes followed the movement, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Richard Blackwell surveyed the board, his mind a whirlwind of calculations. He had anticipated a more formidable opponent in the semifinals. This quiet librarian, with her unassuming demeanor, seemed hardly a match for his decades of experience. He'd employed his usual tactics, the prolonged stares, the barely perceptible sigh of impatience, the subtle shift in his chair that conveyed an air of effortless superiority. Yet, she remained unfazed. Her calm, almost serene expression was unsettling. It wasn't the blankness of ignorance. It was something else, something he couldn't quite decipher. A hint of steel beneath the velvet. He moved his knight, a sharp, decisive clack against the board, a silent declaration of his intent. Sarah considered the board, the pieces arranged in a silent tableau of potential and peril. She felt the weight of Richard's gaze, the palpable pressure of his reputation. But beneath the surface tension, a quiet confidence bloomed. She'd spent years playing with her grandfather, absorbing his wisdom, honing her skills in the quiet sanctuary of their small apartment. His spirit seemed to hover near, a comforting presence in the charged atmosphere of the tournament hall. She moved her bishop, a subtle but significant shift in the balance of power. The game progressed, a slow, intricate dance of attack and defense. Each move was a calculated risk, a silent conversation between two minds. Richard's initial confidence began to erode, replaced by a gnawing unease. This woman, this quiet, unassuming librarian, was playing with a depth and precision that belied her appearance. Her moves were not merely strategic. They were infused with a quiet elegance, a subtle artistry that reminded him of someone, a ghost from his past, a name he hadn't thought of in years. Master Mitchell. Marcus Webb, the tournament director, watched the game with keen interest. He'd seen Richard Blackwell dismantle countless opponents, but this match was different. The air crackled with an unusual intensity. He leaned closer, captivated by the unfolding drama. "Remarkable," he murmured to a nearby spectator. "Blackwell seems off balance. This Mitchell woman, she's playing with the precision of a seasoned grandmaster." James Patterson, Sarah's fourth-round opponent, the mathematics professor who'd scoffed at her quiet demeanor, watched the game with a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her as an amateur. Now he saw the truth. She wasn't just good, she was exceptional. Tom, Sarah's first-round opponent, the kind man who'd offered her words of encouragement, beamed with pride. He'd sensed her potential from the beginning, the quiet strength that lay beneath her gentle exterior. As the game reached its climax, the tension in the hall became almost unbearable. Richard's face, usually a mask of controlled intensity, now betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. He ran a hand through his silver hair, a gesture of frustration. He was losing. Not just losing, but being outmaneuvered, outplayed. By a librarian. The thought stung his pride. Sarah, her focus unwavering, made her final move. A quiet, almost imperceptible shift of her queen. Checkmate. The silence in the hall was deafening. Then a collective gasp rippled through the audience. Richard stared at the board, his eyes fixed on the position of Sarah's queen. He saw it now. The elegant simplicity of her strategy, the quiet brilliance of her execution. He felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of his reputation, the constant pressure to maintain his image of invincibility, suddenly lifted. He looked at Sarah, a genuine smile gracing his lips. "I resign," he said, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance. Sarah met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a quiet warmth. "Thank you for the game, Mr. Blackwell. It was an honor to play someone of your caliber." "The honor," Richard replied, his voice filled with a newfound respect, "was entirely mine. You play with the spirit of Master Mitchell." A faint blush colored Sarah's cheeks. "My grandfather," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "He taught me everything I know." The pieces on the board seemed to shimmer in the soft light, silent witnesses to a legacy revealed, a lesson learned, and the quiet triumph of a hidden genius. The game was over, but the story had just begun. The hushed reverence that had blanketed the room during the final moves now shattered into a cacophony of whispers and gasps. Richard Blackwell, the Grandmaster, the titan of the chess world, had been defeated. Not just defeated, but outmaneuvered, outsmarted, outplayed. By Sarah Mitchell, the quiet librarian. He could feel the weight of 1,000 stares, each a pinprick of disbelief. He had anticipated the roar of the crowd, the flash of cameras capturing his triumphant grin. Instead, he was met with a stunned silence that echoed the hollowness within him. 30 years. 30 years he had spent building his fortress of intimidation, brick by brick, each victory cemented with the psychological dismantling of his opponents. He had studied their weaknesses, exploited their anxieties, and reveled in their surrender. He had become so accustomed to the taste of victory, the intoxicating scent of fear emanating from the other side of the board, that he had forgotten the essence of the game. He had forgotten the quiet joy of a well-placed pawn, the elegant dance of the knight, the silent power of the queen. He stared at the board, the black and white squares blurring in his vision. Sarah's final move, a seemingly simple bishop maneuver, had been a masterpiece of strategy, a quiet whisper of checkmate that had reverberated through his carefully constructed defenses, shattering them like glass. He had felt it coming, a creeping unease, a prickle of doubt that he had tried to suppress, to bury beneath layers of bravado. But it had been too late. The seed of her brilliance had already taken root, growing silently, inexorably, until it had blossomed into this undeniable victory. He looked across the board at Sarah. She sat composed, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the board as if studying some ancient text. Her face was a mask of serene calm, betraying no hint of the storm she had unleashed within him. He had tried to rattle her, to penetrate her quiet demeanor with his usual arsenal of psychological tactics. He had expected fear, uncertainty, perhaps even a flicker of admiration for his legendary status. But she had remained unmoved, her silence a shield against his barbs. Her eyes, though, held a depth he hadn't noticed before, a quiet strength, a knowingness that spoke of battles fought and won on a different battlefield, a battlefield of the mind. He felt a strange pang of respect. It was an unfamiliar emotion, one he rarely felt for anyone, let alone an opponent who had just dethroned him. The room slowly began to regain its voice. Murmurs swelled into conversations, punctuated by the occasional exclamation of disbelief. Marcus Webb, the tournament director, approached the table, his face a mixture of astonishment and professional composure. "A truly remarkable match," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Mitchell, congratulations." A stunning victory. Sarah acknowledged him with a slight nod, her expression unchanged. Richard watched her, a question forming in his mind, a question that gnawed at his pride, at the very foundation of his understanding of the game. He pushed back his chair and stood, the movement drawing the attention of the nearby spectators. He felt their eyes on him, expectant, curious. He walked around the table and extended his hand to Sarah. She looked up at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. He took a deep breath, the words catching in his throat. "I've spent 30 years trying to intimidate opponents," he said, his voice rough with emotion, using psychology as a weapon. "But you just played chess. Pure, beautiful chess." His confession hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his years, his victories, his defeats. Sarah's hand met his, her grip firm but gentle. Her silence was more potent than any words she could have spoken. He saw in her eyes not triumph, not gloating, but a quiet understanding, a shared appreciation for the game that transcended victory or defeat. "My grandfather always said," she finally spoke, her voice soft but clear, "that chess teaches us who we really are." Her words resonated deep within him, echoing the hollowness he had felt moments before. He realized with a sudden clarity that he had lost himself somewhere along the way, lost in the pursuit of victory, the intoxication of power. He had forgotten the true spirit of the game, the quiet beauty of strategy, the intellectual dance between two minds. He had become a caricature of himself, a grandmaster in name only. Sarah, in her quiet strength, her unwavering focus, had reminded him of what it meant to truly play chess, to strip away the layers of ego and intimidation and connect with the essence of the game. He released her hand, a strange sense of peace settling over him. He had lost the match, yes, but he had gained something far more valuable, a renewed appreciation for the game he loved and a glimpse into the depths of his own being. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces still etched with disbelief. He wanted to tell them, to share this newfound understanding, this quiet revelation. But words failed him. He could only offer a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared witness to something extraordinary. The evening light filtered through the tall windows of the chess club, casting long shadows across the room. The murmur of the crowd faded into a quiet hum, a backdrop to the silent conversation that still hung in the air between Richard and Sarah. It was a conversation not of words, but of understanding, of respect, of the shared passion for a game that revealed the hidden depths of the human spirit. And as the last of the spectators filed out, leaving the room in hushed stillness, one could almost hear the faint whisper of a challenge, an invitation to explore the unexplored corners of the mind, to uncover the hidden talents that lie dormant within each of us, waiting to be awakened by the quiet power of a game.